The snow fell like ash from a burning sky, each flake carrying with it the weight of desperation. In the pre-dawn darkness of December 16, 1944, the forests of the Ardennes trembled with more than winter's bite. They shook with the thunder of 250,000 German soldiers preparing to strike what Adolf Hitler believed would be the decisive blow of the Second World War. General Hasso von Manteuffel adjusted his field glasses, peering through the swirling snow at the American lines stretched thin across the Belgian countryside. For months, the Western Front had seemed stable, almost quiet. The Americans, flush with their recent victories in France, had grown comfortable in what they considered a quiet sector. They had no idea that behind the German lines, Hitler had been gathering his reserves for one final desperate offensive, an operation he called Wacht am Rhein, or Watch on the Rhine. The plan was audacious to the point of madness. Hitler intended to punch through the Allied lines, race northwest to capture the vital port of Antwerp, and split the British and American forces in two. If successful, it might force the Western Allies to negotiate a separate peace, allowing Germany to concentrate all its remaining strength against the Soviet Union advancing from the east. It was the fevered dream of a dictator who refused to accept that his thousand-year Reich was crumbling around him. Oberst Friedrich August von der Heydte, commander of the 6th Parachute Regiment, checked his pocket watch in the darkness. 0530 hours. The artillery barrage would begin in minutes, followed by the largest German offensive on the Western Front since 1940. His paratroopers, despite their exhaustion and dwindling supplies, still believed in their Führer's promise of wonder weapons and miraculous victory. Across no man's land, the men of the American 106th Infantry Division huddled in their foxholes, most still asleep. They were green troops, recently arrived from the United States, positioned in what their commanders had assured them was a quiet training area. The division had been in combat for only 5 days, holding a 27-mile front that should have been defended by at least 3 divisions. Private First Class Richard Brookins of Company B, 322nd Infantry Regiment, stirred in his frozen foxhole, awakened by what sounded like distant thunder. The 19-year-old from Indiana had been dreaming of home, of his mother's warm kitchen and the Christmas tree they would have decorated by now. But as the sound grew louder and more distinct, he realized with growing horror that this was no thunderstorm. The German artillery eruption at 5:30 that morning was unlike anything the Americans had experienced in this sector. Shells screamed overhead like banshees, transforming the peaceful Ardennes forest into a hellscape of splintered trees and frozen earth. The 18th Volksgrenadier Division, supported by elements of the 5th Panzer Army, began their advance through the snow-laden landscape, their white camouflage making them nearly invisible against the winter backdrop. As the 1st German infantry emerged from the tree line, Brookins fumbled for his rifle with numb fingers. Around him, his fellow soldiers scrambled from sleep into nightmare, struggling to comprehend that their quiet war had suddenly become anything but. The Battle of the Bulge, though none of them knew that name yet, had begun, and with it would come the greatest test of American resolve in the European theater. By noon on December 16th, the German offensive had torn gaping holes in the American defenses. The morning mist, combined with low-hanging clouds, had grounded Allied aircraft, giving the attackers the element of surprise they desperately needed. Along the Schnee-Eifel Ridge, the positions held by the 106th Infantry Division were becoming increasingly untenable. Major General Allen W. Jones, commanding the 106th, stood in his command post in St. Vith, staring at reports that painted an increasingly grim picture. Communications with his forward units were sporadic, but what he could piece together suggested a coordinated German assault of unprecedented scale. Radio operators reported German voices on American frequencies, speaking perfect English and spreading confusion among the scattered units. The German deception operation, known as Greif, had deployed English-speaking commandos in American uniforms behind Allied lines. Led by Obersturmbannführer Otto Skorzeny, these infiltrators were creating chaos far beyond their actual numbers, spreading false orders and misdirecting traffic at crucial intersections. The psychological impact was immense. Suddenly, every American soldier questioned whether the man beside him might be the enemy. According to a detailed account from the U.S. Army Center of Military History, the German strategy relied heavily on speed and confusion to overcome their material disadvantages. Colonel Hurley Fuller, commanding the 110th Infantry Regiment, found himself cut off near Clairvaux with dwindling ammunition and no clear picture of the enemy's strength. His men had been fighting continuously since dawn, falling back from position to position as waves of German infantry, supported by panzer tanks, pressed their advance. The ancient stone buildings of the medieval town provided some cover, but Fuller knew they could not hold indefinitely. Lieutenant Colonel William Craig, commanding the 1st Battalion of the 110th, had established a defensive line in the town's hotel when German Mark IV tanks began systematically demolishing the buildings around them. The sound of grinding metal and collapsing masonry mixed with the sharp crack of rifle fire and the deeper boom of anti-tank guns. Craig's radio man managed to establish brief contact with division headquarters, reporting their desperate situation before static consumed the transmission. 15 miles to the north, the situation was equally desperate for Combat Command B of the 7th Armored Division, which had been rushed forward to plug gaps in the line. Brigadier General Robert Hasbrouck had arrived to find American units scattered and demoralized, many having abandoned their positions in the face of the German onslaught. His tanks, while mechanically superior to most German armor, were outnumbered and operating without adequate infantry support. The German 62nd Volksgrenadier Division, advancing through the forest southeast of St. Vith, encountered pockets of American resistance that fought with desperate courage despite being overwhelmed. Sergeant Bill Newcomb of the 823rd Tank Destroyer Battalion found himself commanding a hastily assembled group of cooks, clerks, and mechanics who had never expected to engage the enemy directly. As darkness fell on December 16th, the scale of the German offensive became clear to Allied commanders. General Omar Bradley, initially skeptical of reports suggesting a major attack, began to grasp that this was no limited spoiling action, but Hitler's last great gamble on the Western Front. From his headquarters in Luxembourg City, Bradley ordered the movement of reserves, including the 82nd and 101st Airborne Divisions, toward the threatened sector. The German High Command, monitoring radio intercepts and prisoner interrogations, began to believe their surprise had been complete. The roads leading northwest toward the Meuse River beckoned, and with them the possibility of reaching Antwerp and splitting the Allied armies. For a few brief hours, Hitler's desperate vision seemed almost within reach. December 20th brought, with it, the kind of bitter cold that turned breath into ice crystals and transformed weapons into frozen metal that burned bare skin. In the small Belgian town of Bastogne, Brigadier General Anthony McAuliffe of the 101st Airborne Division faced an impossible situation. His paratroopers, rushed forward without adequate winter clothing or supplies, were completely surrounded by German forces advancing toward the vital road junction. Bastogne's strategic importance could not be overstated. 7 major roads converged on the town, making it essential for German supply lines if they hoped to sustain their advance to the Meuse River. The German 5th Panzer Army and 7th Army had bypassed the town in their initial push, expecting it to fall quickly to follow up forces. Instead, they found McAuliffe's Screaming Eagles dug in and determined to hold every street. The siege had begun 3 days earlier when advance elements of the German 2nd Panzer Division had cut the roads leading out of town. Major William de Sobry, commanding a task force from the 10th Armored Division, had arrived just hours before the German ring closed, bringing with him a handful of Sherman tanks and tank destroyers that would prove crucial in the defense. Inside the perimeter, conditions were deteriorating rapidly. Medical supplies were running dangerously low at the makeshift aid stations established in Bastogne's churches and schools. Captain Willis Fowler, the division surgeon, performed operations by candlelight and kerosene lamps, using tablecloths as bandages when proper medical supplies ran out. The wounded lay on pews and classroom floors, many without proper blankets in temperatures that plunged well below freezing. Lieutenant Colonel Paul Danahy, the division intelligence officer, had intercepted German radio communications, suggesting that surrender terms would soon be offered. The German commanders, confident in their overwhelming superiority in numbers, believed the surrounded Americans would see reason and avoid unnecessary bloodshed. They had seriously underestimated the resolve of McAuliffe and his paratroopers. On the morning of December 22nd, 4 German officers approached the American lines under a flag of truce. Major Alvin Jones of the 327th Glider Infantry escorted them blindfolded to McAuliffe's headquarters in the Belgian Army barracks. The German ultimatum was brief and to the point: surrender honorably or face annihilation by superior German forces closing in from all directions. McAuliffe's response would become legendary in military history. After reading the surrender demand, he crumpled the paper and uttered a single word that captured the spirit of his surrounded paratroopers: nuts. When the Germans requested clarification of this American colloquialism, Colonel Joseph Harper, the regimental commander, provided a more detailed translation that left no doubt about the American intention to continue fighting. The German reaction was swift and brutal. Artillery and rocket fire intensified, turning the medieval streets of Bastogne into a maze of rubble and smoke. The 35th Infantry Regiment of the 26th Volksgrenadier Division launched a series of coordinated attacks against the perimeter, supported by tanks and assault guns. Each attack was met with fierce resistance from the dug-in Americans, who had turned every building into a fortress and every intersection into a killing field. Private First Class Joseph Willis of the 502nd Parachute Infantry Regiment found himself defending a roadblock on the Arlon Road with nothing but a bazooka and 3 rounds of ammunition. German Panther tanks approached through the morning fog, their commanders confident that the American line would crack under the weight of their assault. Willis waited until the lead tank was within 50 yards before firing his first rocket, watching with satisfaction as it penetrated the armor and sent the crew scrambling for safety. As Christmas Eve approached, the situation inside Bastogne remained desperate. Food was rationed to 1 meal per day, ammunition was being conserved for only the most critical situations, and medical supplies were virtually exhausted. Yet morale remained remarkably high among McAuliffe's defenders, sustained by their knowledge that help was on the way and their absolute refusal to surrender to the enemy. General George Smith Patton, Jr. paced the floor of his headquarters in Nancy, France, like a caged predator. The flamboyant commander of the Third Army had been planning his next offensive against the Siegfried Line when the German attack in the Ardennes changed everything. Now, Supreme Allied Commander General Dwight David Eisenhower was asking him to perform what many considered impossible: pivot his entire army 90 degrees north and relieve the surrounded garrison at Bastogne. The logistics alone were staggering. Patton needed to move over 100,000 men, hundreds of tanks, and thousands of vehicles across more than 100 miles of snow-covered roads in the middle of winter. His staff officers, led by Deputy Chief of Staff Colonel Halley Maddox, worked around the clock to coordinate fuel supplies, ammunition convoys, and maintenance support for what would become one of the most remarkable military maneuvers in American history. Major General Hugh Gaffey, commanding the 4th Armored Division, received his orders on December 20th. Drive north immediately and break through to Bastogne. His tanks, many equipped with crude but effective steel plates welded to their fronts for additional protection, began their advance through the snow-laden countryside south of the besieged town. The weather had cleared enough to allow some air support, but the roads remained treacherous with ice and snow. Combat Command A, led by Lieutenant Colonel Creighton Abrams, spearheaded the relief effort along the Arlen-Bastogne Highway. His Sherman tanks, supported by infantry from the 51st Armored Infantry Battalion, encountered fierce German resistance at every village and crossroads. The German 4th Panzer Division had established a series of defensive positions designed to delay any relief attempt long enough for Bastogne to fall to direct assault. The fighting was brutal and personal, conducted in close quarters among snow-covered hedgerows and frozen farmyards. Tank Commander Staff Sergeant Charles Boggess of the 37th Tank Battalion found his Sherman locked in a deadly game of cat and mouse with a German Panzer IV hidden behind a stone farmhouse. The engagement lasted nearly an hour, with both tanks maneuvering for position while infantry from both sides took cover and waited for an opportunity to attack. Meanwhile, elements of the 26th Infantry Division, part of Patton's northern thrust, were fighting their own desperate battle to reach Bastogne from the southeast. Colonel Harry Paul, commanding the 104th Infantry Regiment, led his men through dense forests, where German machine gun nests had been carefully positioned to create overlapping fields of fire. Each advance measured in yards rather than miles, with casualties mounting steadily in the bitter cold. As documented in the official Army records of the European Theater of Operations, Patton's ability to rapidly redeploy such a large force demonstrated both his tactical genius and the logistical capabilities of the American military machine. Back in Bastogne, McAuliffe's defenders could hear the distant rumble of artillery that marked Patton's approach. Radio communications had been restored intermittently, providing updates on the relief columns, progress while also revealing the desperate nature of their situation. German attacks were intensifying as enemy commanders realized their window of opportunity was closing rapidly. Captain James Parker of the 35th Tank Destroyer Battalion had positioned his guns at key points around Bastogne's perimeter, using them as mobile artillery to break up German infantry attacks. His crews, working in temperatures that froze the oil in their weapons, maintained their positions despite frostbite and exhaustion. When German tanks approached their positions, Parker's men would wait until the last possible moment before revealing themselves, maximizing the effectiveness of their limited ammunition. By December 24th, Christmas Eve, Patton's lead elements were within 5 miles of Bastogne. The sound of his artillery could be clearly heard by the surrounded paratroopers, providing a psychological boost that was almost as valuable as the tactical support. German resistance was stiffening as they committed their reserves to prevent the link-up, but Patton's momentum was building with each passing hour. The race was entering its final phase, with American armor grinding forward through snow and mud, while German defenders fought with the desperation of men who knew that failure meant not just tactical defeat, but the collapse of Hitler's last great offensive in the West. December 26th, 1944 dawned clear and bitterly cold over the snow-covered Ardennes. For the first time in 10 days, Allied aircraft could take to the skies in significant numbers, and the sound of American fighter bombers soon filled the air above Bastogne. The weather break came at the perfect moment for the besieged defenders and Patton's advancing relief columns. Lieutenant Colonel Creighton Abrams, leading Combat Command A of the 4th Armored Division, had spent Christmas Day fighting through the village of Assenois, just 4 miles south of Bastogne. His Shermans had battered through German roadblocks and anti-tank positions, leaving a trail of destroyed vehicles and desperate enemy soldiers in their wake. Now, as afternoon shadows lengthened, Abrams could see the church spires of Bastogne ahead through his tank's periscope. First Lieutenant Charles Boggess, commanding a Sherman tank named Cobra King, was chosen to lead the final push into the besieged town. His tank, followed by 4 others from Company C of the 37th Tank Battalion, rolled down the snow-covered road toward Bastonia's outskirts at 1550 hours. German artillery shells exploded around them, throwing up geysers of frozen earth and snow, but nothing could stop their advance now. At the edge of Bastonia, near a railroad underpass, Boggess encountered the first American paratroopers he had seen in days. Staff Sergeant Theodore Palutis of the 326th Airborne Engineer Battalion emerged from a foxhole, his uniform torn and blackened from days of fighting, but his smile unmistakable. "Where have you been?" he called out to Boggess, voicing the question that every defender of Bastonia had been asking for the past week. The link-up sent a surge of electricity through both the relieving forces and the defenders. Within hours, supply trucks were rolling into Bastonia, carrying medical supplies, ammunition, food, and, perhaps most importantly, winter clothing for the paratroopers who had been fighting in summer uniforms. Captain Willis Fowler, who had been performing surgery by candlelight, finally had proper medical supplies and could begin treating the backlog of wounded soldiers. General McAuliffe, emerging from his basement command post for the first time in days, surveyed the damage to his town with a mixture of pride and sadness. Bastogne had been transformed into a moonscape of rubble and bomb craters, but it remained in American hands. His paratroopers had proved that the German army could be stopped, even when surrounded and outnumbered. However, the German High Command was not yet ready to concede defeat. General Heinz Guderian, chief of the Army Genera, L Staff, ordered fresh reserves to launch one final assault on Bastogne. The 1st SS Panzer Division, Leibstandarte Adolf Hitler, supported by the 12th SS Panzer Division, Hitlerjugend, prepared for a desperate attack designed to recapture the town and cut off Patton's relief corridor. The attack came on December 30th, preceded by the heaviest artillery barrage the Germans could muster. Oberfuhrer Wilhelm Mohnke, commanding the Leibstandarte, personally led his panzer grenadiers through the snow-covered fields north of Bastogne, determined to prove that the elite Waffen-SS could accomplish what the regular army had failed to achieve. The assault met fierce resistance from both the original defenders and Patton's reinforcements. Colonel Steve Chapoy of the 502nd Parachute Infantry Regiment had positioned his men in carefully prepared positions that took advantage of every fold in the ground and every remaining building. His paratroopers, now properly equipped and supplied, fought with the confidence of men who knew they were no longer alone. Tank battles raged across the frozen landscape as German Panthers and American Shermans engaged in deadly duels among the snow-laden pine trees. The 42nd Tank Battalion, part of the 11th Armored Division, had arrived just in time to reinforce the perimeter. Lieutenant Colonel Nicholas Novosel positioned his tanks in hull-down positions that maximized their defensive advantages while minimizing their exposure to German anti-tank weapons. By January 1st, 1945, it was clear that the German offensive had run out of steam. Fuel shortages, which had plagued the operation from its beginning, were becoming critical. Many German units were abandoning their vehicles and retreating on foot through the snow, leaving behind a trail of equipment they could no longer afford to lose. The relief of Bastogne marked the beginning of the end for Hitler's Ardennes offensive, but the battle was far from over. The Germans still held substantial territory in Belgium, and Allied commanders knew that eliminating the Bulge would require weeks of additional fighting in some of the worst winter conditions experienced by American forces during the entire war. January 1945 brought no respite from the brutal Ardennes winter. American forces, now reinforced and resupplied, began the methodical task of pushing German forces back to their original positions. What had started as Hitler's desperate gamble was becoming a costly defeat that Germany could ill afford, draining precious reserves that might have been used to defend the Reich itself. General Omar Bradley, commanding the 12th Army Group, coordinated a massive pincer movement designed to eliminate the German salient. From the north, Field Marshal Bernard Law Montgomery's 21st Army Group, including the American First Army under Lieutenant General Courtney Hodges, would attack southward. From the south, Patton's Third Army would drive north, meeting somewhere in the middle to trap whatever German forces remained in the Bulge, and the practical reality that their forces were being systematically destroyed. General Hasso von Manteuffel, whose 5th Panzer Army had spearheaded the initial breakthrough, pleaded with Army Group B Commander Field Marshal Walter Model to begin an orderly retreat before it became a rout. Lieutenant General Joseph Collins, commanding the 7th Corps, launched his attack on January 3rd with the objective of recapturing the town of Houffalize, a key German supply center. His forces included the 2nd and 3rd Armored Divisions, supported by infantry from the 83rd and 84th Infantry Divisions. The advance proved slower than anticipated as German engineers had prepared extensive defensive positions and mined every approach route. The fighting took on a different character from the mobile warfare of the initial German offensive. Now it became a grinding battle of attrition, with American forces methodically clearing each village and each hillside, while German forces conducted a fighting withdrawal. The weather remained a constant enemy for both sides, with temperatures often dropping to -20 degrees Fahrenheit. Major General Morris Rose, commanding the 3rd Armored Division, pushed his tanks through snowdrifts that sometimes reached above the track level. His task force commanders, including Lieutenant Colonel William Lovelady and Lieutenant Colonel Robert Howes, had learned to coordinate closely with infantry units who could clear German Panzerfaust teams from concealed positions among the trees. According to contemporary reports from war correspondents like Ernie Pyle, the conditions faced by American soldiers during this phase of the battle were among the most challenging of the entire European campaign. The German withdrawal was complicated by civilian refugees fleeing the combat zone. Thousands of Belgian families, caught between the opposing armies, struggled through the snow with whatever possessions they could carry. American commanders faced difficult decisions about allocating scarce transportation resources between military supplies and humanitarian aid for these displaced civilians. Captain Charles MacDonald of the 23rd Infantry Regiment, 1st Infantry Division, led his company through the village of Foy on January 13th. The town had changed hands 3 times during the battle, and the destruction was almost complete. House-to-house fighting had reduced most buildings to rubble, and the streets were littered with abandoned equipment from both armies. The German resistance, while determined, was clearly weakening. Prisoners taken during this phase of the battle told a consistent story of supply shortages, equipment failures, and declining morale. Many German soldiers, particularly the younger ones from the recently formed Volksgrenadier divisions, seemed relieved to be captured and removed from the brutal winter fighting. By January 16th, exactly 1 month after the German offensive had begun, American forces from the north and south made contact near Houffalize. The symbolic link-up was achieved when patrols from the 84th Infantry Division met elements of the 11th Armored Division on the road between Houffalize and St. Vith. The German Bulge had been eliminated, and Allied forces were back to positions similar to those they had held before the attack began. The cost of this achievement was enormous. American casualties during the Battle of the Bulge exceeded 81,000 men, including nearly 19,000 killed in action. German losses were even higher, with estimates ranging upward of 100,000 casualties. More importantly for Germany, the offensive had consumed strategic reserves that could never be replaced, reserves that might have prolonged the defense of the German homeland. The victory belonged to the individual American soldiers who had endured conditions that tested human endurance to its limits and emerged victorious through sheer determination and courage. February 1st, 1945, found the Ardennes forest quiet for the first time in 7 weeks. The snow that had been stained with blood was now pristine white again, covering the scars of battle beneath a deceptive blanket of peace. American engineers worked methodically to clear mines and repair the damaged infrastructure, while Graves registration units began the somber task of identifying and burying the fallen. General Dwight David Eisenhower visited the former battlefields in early February, touring the devastated towns of Bastogne, St. Vith, and Malmedy. The Supreme Allied commander spoke with soldiers who had endured the German onslaught and lived to see victory. Their accounts reinforced his conviction that the Battle of the Bulge had demonstrated something crucial about American character. When faced with seemingly impossible odds, American soldiers had not only survived, but prevailed. The strategic consequences of Hitler's failed offensive were becoming clear to military analysts on both sides. Germany had gambled its last mobile reserves and lost them all. The panzer divisions that had spearheaded the attack were shadows of their former strength, their experienced crews dead or captured, their equipment destroyed or abandoned in the Belgian forests. More critically, the delay caused by the Ardennes offensive had given the Soviet Union additional time to prepare its final offensive against Berlin. Colonel Trevor Dupuy, a military historian attached to Bradley's headquarters, began collecting first-hand accounts from participants while memories remained fresh. His interviews with soldiers from every level of command revealed the human dimension of what strategists were already calling one of the most significant battles of the war. From General McAuliffe's defiant "nuts" to Private Brookens's desperate defense of his frozen foxhole, individual acts of courage had combined to achieve strategic victory. The psychological impact of the battle extended far beyond military circles. In the United States, news of the German offensive had initially caused alarm among civilians who thought the war in Europe was nearly won. The revelation that American forces could be surprised and initially overwhelmed had been sobering. However, the ultimate victory, achieved through determination rather than superior firepower, had reinforced American confidence in their citizen soldiers. British Field Marshal Montgomery, despite his personal conflicts with American commanders, acknowledged the significance of what had been accomplished. In his private correspondence, later declassified, Montgomery wrote that the Battle of the Bulge had proven that American forces could maintain cohesion and fighting effectiveness even under the most adverse circumstances. The town of Bastogne became a symbol that transcended its tactical importance. The siege and relief of the small Belgian town captured public imagination in a way that larger battles had not. McAuliffe's paratroopers were celebrated not just as skilled soldiers but as representatives of democratic values refusing to yield to tyranny. Their story was told in newspapers across America and became part of the national mythology of World War II. For the German military, the failure of the Ardennes offensive marked the final collapse of any realistic hope for avoiding total defeat. Officers who had served in the operation later wrote that they recognized its failure as the moment when the war truly ended, even though fighting would continue for 4 more months. The elite units that had participated, the Leibstandarte, the 2nd Panzer Division, the Panzer Lehr Division, would never again possess the strength to mount serious offensive operations. The lessons learned during the Battle of the Bulge would influence American military doctrine for decades to come. The importance of maintaining communications under adverse conditions, the value of small unit leadership, and the necessity of rapid logistical response to crisis situations all became embedded in military training programs. The battle demonstrated that technological superiority, while important, could not substitute for individual courage and determination. Perhaps most significantly, the Battle of the Bulge had shown the world that American democracy could produce soldiers willing to fight with the same determination as those serving totalitarian regimes. The paratroopers who held Bastogne and the tank crews who relieved them had proved that free men could match the fanaticism of Nazi ideology with something more powerful, the resolve of people fighting for principles they genuinely believed in. As spring arrived in the Ardennes, bringing new growth to forests scarred by battle, the story of those winter weeks entered history as more than just another military victory. It became proof that in the darkest hours, when the outcome seemed most uncertain, the character of ordinary people could determine the fate of nations. The Battle of the Bulge had indeed shown the world Allied resolve, and in doing so, it hastened the end of the most destructive war in human history.